Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Lunch with Books live stream. We have a very special program for you today. Before we get to that, I just have a couple of announcements about the next 2 weeks. On March 2nd, next Tuesday at noon, Billy O'Callahan will be here. He lives in Cork, Ireland, so we'll be coming to you live from Ireland. And then on March 9th, Cameron Barnett, who's a local poet from Pittsburgh, will be here for the Wheeling Poetry Series with West Virginia Poet Laureate Mark Harshman as your host, as usual. So those are our next two programs, all literature, and today is literature as well. So if you're a fan, and I know many of you are in for a treat. So first of all, I'd like to say that this is our second Ann Thomas Memorial Lecture Series program. Last year we had Dr. Joe Trotter from Carnegie University, Carnegie Mellon. And I'm very pleased we have another high quality guest for you today. And I'm just going to say that we have Scott Thomas here with us again, who's going to introduce our guest. So I'm going to go away now. Here's Scott Thomas.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I am honored and proud to participate my second consecutive year with Lunch with Books, a memoriam to my mother, the guiding light and force in my life, even though she's passed. Yesterday was actually the second year anniversary of her passing and celebration of her life. And I can't say enough about Sean Duffy and all of his works with what he's able to present to the public and anyone who's able to delve in and take advantage of this format that we've been forced to via COVID, unfortunately. But yes, welcome everyone, and it's with great pleasure that I get to introduce the second event speaker, Miss Crystal Wilkinson. I'm sorry.
Thank you. I want to thank Lunch with Books program and the sponsors of the Wheeling Lecture here at the Ohio County Library, and a special thank you to Sean Duffy, who's coordinated my visit. And I also want to thank you, Scott Thomas, and the Thomas family for sharing the legacy of this special woman with us. I'm honored to be here to help honor her life, the life and work of Miss Beatrice Ann Prince Thomas. I've had the pleasure of going to the Wheeling Memory Project and listening to her speak, and also reading an introduction to her at the YWCA event a few years ago, where she was introduced by Larry Jones, retired superintendent of Ohio County Schools. And I felt a kinship with her deep roots in this region, with her memories of living through the struggles of Jim Crow, the Jim Crow era, as well as her contribution to this community. In his introduction, Larry Jones says that she was a hero of his. Sean Duffy also told me earlier and just said again that she was a hero of his as well and changed his life. And I'm sure she was a hero to her family, like Scott said, and many others in this community. I never had the pleasure to meet her, but now I consider her among my sheroes too. I wanted to talk a little bit about Black people in Appalachia, and then share a little piece of my own writing with you. Traditionally, when people speak about Appalachia and Appalachians, they're already working from a stereotype. Even in recent times, Appalachians have been portrayed as rotten teeth, Mountain Dew guzzling, uneducated people. And I'm not saying that we don't have some of those around. We all probably know some, but of course we do. But they also have those in larger cities and elsewhere in the country. But we also have teachers, we have lawyers, we have activists, we have musicians, artists, nurses like Miss Thomas, writers, and a world of intellectual, kind-hearted, spirited individuals. So when I ask people, where is Appalachia? People mention Kentucky, which is my home state. They mention Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia right away, but they don't often mention Alabama or Georgia or Maryland or Mississippi or New York or North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, or South Carolina. The Appalachian Regional Commission defines Appalachia as a 205,000 square mile region that follows the spine of the mountains, Appalachian Mountains, from southern New York to northern Mississippi. So, of course, it includes all of the state that we're in. I'm in virtually with you guys in West Virginia, and 12 parts of those other states. So, with 24.8 million people living in 420 counties of the Appalachian region, 42% of the region's population is rural, compared to about 20%. And of this 25 million people, 1.9 million are Black. So that's a lot of folks. It's been noted that the presence of Black people in Appalachia was documented as early as the 1500s, when Spanish and French explorers brought both African slaves and free persons of color with them to this region. So we were among the earliest settlers. Slavery was alive and well in the mountains, and much of the African American presence was due to slavery, but mountain slavery wasn't the same as the plantation slavery in the South. Many of those were wealthy people, but in the mountains, there were farmers, mining, logging, working at stores and in inns and those sort of things. After the Civil War, many free Blacks obtained land to farm and lived rural lifestyles similar to theirs of their white counterparts. And the African American presence in Appalachia remains to this day. And I think the invisibility of our presence is often the same as the prolific misrepresentation of Appalachia as a whole. So the question that I always have in the back of my work, or sort of floating underneath my work, is if all Appalachians are deemed minors, and if they're all deemed white, then where's there room for Black Appalachians? And we're not often spoken of. But the influence is everywhere. There are a lot of people that are Appalachians, Black Appalachians. Black Appalachians have given us the banjo, W.C. Handy, Bessie Smith, Nina Simone, Roberta Flack, Bill Withers, Booker T. Washington, Carter G. Woodson, and so forth and so on. And much of the scholarly influence, I'm excited that so many scholars are writing again about Appalachia. And much of that started with an early book called Blacks in Appalachia, which was published by Ed Cabell and Bill Turner in 1985. And so I belong to a group called the Appalachian Poets, and we have been doing writing work in the region for over 20 years. And there's a scholar named Teresa Burris out of Radford University that is also doing this work. So it's special to me because my own family lived in the hills of Kentucky for 200 years, and that is what I write about most. So I wanted to share with you all an essay that is part of a new book that will be be published in August of 2021, and it's called Perfect Black. And I hope you've eaten, because it's an essay about food, but also about ancestry. So it's called Praise Song for the Kitchen Ghost. And the images that you will see are members of my family, and I hope we have a little bit of time to talk about it at the end if people have questions. People are always surprised that Black people reside in the hills of Appalachia. Those not surprised that we were there are surprised that we stayed. My family lived in the hills of Kentucky for 4 generations. My grandmother came from a long line of women who worked hard and cooked well. The long list of foods I'll describe here will make you think my folks had deep pockets, but they didn't. Hardworking, poor Black folks who couldn't break the barriers of nepotism or racism in education or the workforce, they continued the tradition of farming: tobacco, corn, a few head of cattle, a few dairy cows. My grandparents lived primarily off the land. They owned 64 acres and had a modest income from the crops they raised. My grandfather prided himself on taking care of his family, his animals, and his land. My grandmother prided herself on making sure her family was fed. I read somewhere once that pride stems from fear. I imagine my grandparents were hungry more than once in their youth, but I never was. Every morning of my childhood, my grandmother, who stood a little under 5 feet tall, donned an apron and cooked breakfast. Slow, precise, deliberate. She equated food with love, and she cooked with both a fury and a quiet joy. She fried bacon, sausage, or country ham. She scrambled fluffy yellow eggs with a wire whisk in a ceramic bowl. The eggs came from our chickens. She made biscuits from scratch. The lard was rendered from our pigs. The milk came from our cows. She rolled out the dough and threw flour into the air like magic dust. She churned butter, made the preserves from pears, peaches, or blackberries that she picked herself. We had orange juice and milk. We ate on white plates with blue flowers around the edges and a blue landscape in the center. And more often than not, we had brimming cups of sweet black tea that sat in saucers alongside our meal. Our forks clinked musically against our plates. We ate at the kitchen table, mostly in silence or quiet conversation. My cousin Deborah calls. She tells me there are green tomatoes at the farmer's market. She still lives near our home place in Stanford, Kentucky. I live 40 miles away in Lexington. Sometimes I drive 80 miles round trip and buy vegetables sold by my cousin George Allen and his wife Susan, who own a farm, or from other farmers in the area. On the Miller's Farm's Facebook page, they post pictures of their bounty, which is as beautiful as any parental brag book. They boast of heirloom tomatoes and cucumbers, cantaloupe, beans, squash, and zucchini. They are carrying on the tradition. Black farmers are nearly extinct. Tell me again how you fix greens without fat back, my cousin Deborah says. I tell her, first you saute the garlic and onion in vegetable oil in a pot. Then add a pinch of red pepper flakes, salt. Let the vegetables soften. Wash the dirt from your greens. Slice them long ways in ribbons with a butcher knife. Put them in the pot, one handful at a time. Cast iron works best. Let them cook down. Sprinkle only a bit of water if they're about to scorch. I like them with some heft now, not cooked all day. My grandmother, like many people from Appalachia, called the meal in the middle of the day dinner. Sometimes she made sandwiches or hamburgers, but sandwiches weren't likely in our home. I remember chicken and dumplings, pot roast, or peas and pork chops. Sometimes there were brown beans, vegetable soup, or chili, fried corn fresh from the garden. Sometimes she placed a salad in the middle of the table in a brown wooden bowl. Occasionally, new lettuce with onions wilted with bacon grease. There was always cornbread or rolls. There was always pie. She always set the table, and my grandfather always led us in prayer. My grandfather raised pigs and cured hams that hung from the rafters in the smokehouse. My grandmother was a domestic worker. She cleaned houses for white folks. Before and after she went to work, she fetched water from the well. She slopped the hogs, canned vegetables, and stored them in the cellar. She fed the chickens, milked cows, shucked corn, sewed clothes for herself and me, quilted, but still, there were always 3 meals on that table, precise, orderly, delicious. Every morning of my childhood, my grandmother, who stood a little under 5 feet tall, donned an apron and cooked breakfast. At night, when my cousin is not working for Toyota, William is a chef in training. Right before Thanksgiving, he contacts me on social media and is in need of our grandmother's jam cake recipe. I sent him a photograph of the recipe in her handwriting. Our grandmother writes in her perfect cursive, 3 sticks of butter, 2 cups of flour, 6 eggs, and so forth. I won't read the whole recipe. He says, on my way to the store, and I'll send you pictures. I still bake my grandmother's jam cake with caramel icing at Christmas, though no one in my immediate family likes it. Cinnamon plus cloves equals childhood, equals love. Supper in my childhood was always on the table by 6 in the evening. Lamb fries, frog legs, fried whiting or catfish, neck bones, fried chicken livers or gizzards, corn pudding, tall glasses of cold water pulled from the well or sweet iced tea, biscuits topped with cooked rhubarb, butter, and sugar. After supper, we'd watch TV. Sometimes I ventured out to catch June bugs or lightning bugs in a mason jar. My grandfather nodded in the reclining chair. My grandmother sewed or quilted, but she always had her eye on something in the oven, bread, a pie for the preacher, or someone who'd lost a loved one. I read a book. There was always something dead in our kitchen. On occasion, a squirrel or rabbit shot and skinned by my grandfather, a bucket of recently caught fish, a chicken, still with feathers. I remember an entire hog's head in a galvanized tub, its tongue sticking out. My grandmother hoisted the tub with the hog's head up on the stove. It covered all 4 burners. After it cooked all night, my grandmother made souse. She used a hand-cranked meat grinder to make relish from cucumbers, onions, and green peppers. By nightfall, everything outdoors belonged to nature, but inside, we were full and warm and fed. They are carrying on the tradition. Black farmers are nearly extinct. Last year, when I began researching my ancestry for a novel I'm writing, I found Aggie, who was my grandmother's great-grandmother. Aggie of color was born in 1795 into slavery in Virginia. My research indicates she was brought to Kentucky by the Wilkinson family in the early 1800s. She had 10 children by Tarleton Wilkinson, who owned her. He is my grandmother's great-grandfather. Aggie remained with Tarleton until he died. As a free woman, she owned land near the place where I grew up. My research ends in 1853, after Tarleton died. Records documenting her existence vanished, but I imagine her. I envision her over a large cast iron pot, first in her master's kitchen and finally in her own. She fed 10 children, more than my grandmother's 7, more than my own 3. Did she learn to cook from her mother, another cook in the heat of the master's kitchen? Food rations for Kentucky's slaves usually consisted of cornmeal and flour, lard, a bit of fat meat, dried beans or peas, and molasses. If the slave owner allowed it, sometimes the enslaved families grew their own patches of corn, potatoes, turnips, pumpkins, greens, or yellow squash. From Aggie to Lizzie to Lily to Christine, my grandmother, to my mother, Dorsey, to me, we are all the links in this chain. After college, I would return home to the hills. My grandmother would help me settle my 3 children, then encourage me to climb into my childhood bed and rest while she cooked my favorite foods. I listened to the sounds of her rearranging pots and pans, smelled the aroma throughout the house as she prepared each dish. Sometimes I ventured out to help her, and she invited me to sit and talk, but I wasn't allowed to work. Sometimes she shooed me away, and I returned to the bed cozy and nostalgic. Rick James, Prince, and a black light poster from my teen years still covered the walls of my bedroom. Sometimes from the bed, I heard my children laughing through an open window, drunk on the freedom of the farm and the sweets she'd made for them. Mashed potatoes floating in butter, green beans from the garden swimming in pork fat, chicken fried to crispy perfection, a simple salad with iceberg lettuce, tomato, and French dressing, sweet iced tea in a clear glass decorated with yellow lemons. After I ate the meal, my grandmother brought out my favorite desserts, rice pudding with perfect peaks of toasted meringue, or blackberry cobbler with ice cream, a perfect meal for a tired single mother, a lost job, another failed relationship, loneliness. When my children were young, I cooked a large meal for them every night. Oxtail and sauerkraut, fried chicken, pancakes with homemade cocoa on weekends, chili made from the tomatoes my grandmother canned. When I was missing my grandmother, I made pot roast with potatoes and carrots. I fried corn. I hated stewed tomatoes, but I made it anyway because she did. Chopped steak with gravy or fried pork chops with new potatoes and shuck beans. For dessert, I made strawberry pie or yellow cake with caramel icing. I was a single mother. I worked at Arby's. I went to college. I cleaned offices at night. I worked as a news assistant at the local newspaper. I worked in public relations. I went to graduate school. I became a professor. I made everything from scratch. My children were grown before I stopped cooking like that. I've spent my entire life striving to be a woman worth my grandmother's salt. My grandmother never named her cooking method, but I would call it mindful. I'm sure she was thinking of her own mother, her own grandmother as she prepared our meals. I'm not Buddhist, but I'm interested in the practice of mindful eating and cooking. I like this idea of tapping into your emotions before, during, and after cooking. I like thinking about where my ingredients came from, how my grandmother would have prepared the recipe, who might have grown the vegetables, how much the animal might have suffered, what time the farmer might have gotten up. My grandmother was married at 14. She raised 7 children, then she raised me after my mother had a nervous breakdown and was institutionalized. My grandmother attended to my grandfather's every need, refilling his water cup, bringing him seconds, a plate of cake or cornbread with sorghum. When my twins were little, they were scrawny little girls. My grandmother followed them around with a bowl of rice with butter and sugar. Just take a bite, she'd plead with them. She cooked for the church, big dishes of macaroni and cheese, large savory hunks of mutton in gravy and mounds of fried chicken, German chocolate cakes, sweet potatoes, green beans. She and the other elder women served food out the window of the church dining room for $1 a plate when the church held basket meetings or revivals. Folks from neighboring churches all around would crowd around her window. I rarely saw her sit down at any table and eat. She once told me that food didn't taste as good after she'd cooked all day. Before a holiday, she spent days preparing a meal. But after she served the dinner, she often sat in the corner of the kitchen and ate only a few bites from her small salad plate while everyone else ate in the dining room. Sometimes I would sit with her. I remember the silence. Laughter and talking could be heard from the dining room, but she sat there in her corner, savoring her small meal, not saying much. I don't know if she was in meditation or if she was just bone tired. I wish I'd asked her those questions. Sometimes she expressed disappointment. The rolls didn't rise right, she might say, or too much sage in the dressing. As training for mindful eating, I examine a single tangerine, the brilliant shades of orange and green, the small brown indentation where the fruit was once attached to the tree. Smell, run my fingers lightly across the pimply surface, close my eyes, breathe, then peel. Reveal the rind, bare the fruit. Notice the first squirt of juice where it lands on my neck and blouse. I section, masticate, swallow. I am always reaching back. Years after our grandmother has died, I called Deborah to ask if she remembers the gingerbread sauce. It had raisins in it, I say. It was simple, but so good. Deborah calls her mother Aunt Lo, my grandmother's daughter-in-law. Our grandparents are dead. Aunt Lo is 89. Uncle Bub, her husband, is dead. Aunt Lo and Uncle Bub spent the early years of their marriage living with my grandparents. Aunt Lo remembers. She gives me the recipe. I don't allow my cousin to tell me how to mix the ingredients. I want the muscle memory in my body to guide me back across the back roads of Kentucky to Indian Creek and through the screen door of our grandmother's kitchen. I can feel it when I catch the right rhythm. I stir, let the sauce simmer until it's thick. I slice a block of gingerbread into a ceramic bowl. I spoon on the sauce. I taste and I remember. A few years ago, I was asked to lead a food presentation in Hyman, Kentucky at Dumplings and Dancing, a gathering of farmers, dancers, chefs, and food activists committed to the preservation of Appalachian foodways and music traditions. I was asked to demonstrate Food Network style my grandmother's chicken and dumplings. As a writer, my first inclination was just to write something and read it. But mountain people are stubborn. They insisted. Nervous, I came armed with history. On the kitchen door, I hung my grandmother's dress, a dress that she had sewn and worn. I placed her photograph on the prep station and I began. I heft the heavy stock pot, add chicken, water, and salt. My grandmother used pieces cut from a whole chicken. I just used the breast. While the chicken is simmering, I make dumplings. 2 cups of self-rising flour, a half cup of shortening, 1 cup of buttermilk. I cut the shortening into the flour. I add the buttermilk. I sprinkle flour on the table, roll out the dough. Once the chicken is done, I reduce the broth. I let the chicken cool, shred it into bite-sized chunks, add the dough. The pieces of tender meat float in the bowl with the swirls of yellow fat and fluffy dumplings. I serve the dish with a pone of cornbread. I smile at my grandmother's photograph, see her as a kitchen ghost. I thank her for being there. Last month, while my cousin Darlene was babysitting her grandchildren for the week, she calls me and asks where she can buy fresh vegetables. I point her in the direction of every farmer's market I know in Lexington. And of course, this leads to a discussion of our heritage. You're doing it, I say, like Granny and Aunt Lo did. I need to get back home and tend my garden, she says proudly. I need to do my canning. She tells me that along with the vegetables, she cans chicken. Chicken, I say, in mason jars? I don't remember our grandmother canning meat, but we are the kitchen ghosts of the future, morphing, changing the way things are done. Darlene is not satisfied with the produce she finds in the city, not the prices, not the quality. We talk about the value of a vine-ripened tomato from down home. A little bit of jealousy rises up in me when she talks about her garden, simple, ancient rituals in the path of our ancestors' footstep. She hoes and bends and weeds and harvests. She serves her own food on the table. She is innovative and lively in her kitchen, looking for ways to blend our old ways with the new. Years ago, when I left my grandmother's house, she filled my car with rations, jars of bright red canned tomatoes for soup, paper sacks of dried apples for making fried pies, recipes, whole cakes, jars of relish, chow chow, we called it, and green beans. A jar of green beans she canned still sits on my counter. I refuse to use it because it is the last one she gifted me before she died. I rearrange the items on my counter so that the mason jar is in my line of sight while I cook. I have some of my grandmother's pans and serving dishes. Cooking for me is part anxiety, part meditation. I invite each kitchen ghost in with open arms. I take up the knife, they watch. I take up the spoon and the knife. I slice, I pour, I begin. My grandmother nursed my fevers, kissed my bruises, encouraged my dreams. She filled first her pots and then our bellies in the same way that her mother and grandmothers had for generations, through slavery, through manumission, through the Great Depression, through wars, through poverty, through segregation, through the civil rights movement, through racism. Women of this ilk always find a way. At my house, I have my go-to stash of recipes memorized. When we eat vegetarian, I make a mean baked tofu that my husband Ron swears tastes like fried fish. When we were on our way to becoming vegan, I developed a recipe for vegetarian breakfast sausage that I prepped each Sunday for the following week. When we are carnivores, as we are currently, one of my specialties is meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and fresh collards sauteed in garlic. It's rare that I cook anything experimental or extraordinary, but I do have a few invented dishes that I've been cooking for 20 years. My adult children refer to them as the corn and cream stuff or the rice and tomato and beef thing, and of course there are classics. Even after 12 years of bliss, after every meal I cook, I always ask my husband, how was it? Was it good for you? If my husband says he doesn't like a meal or is nonchalant about it, tears well up in my eyes. Sometimes I become angry. Baby, it was fine, he says, when he sees me growing sullen. But is it just fine? My grandmother didn't teach me how to cook so that my meals would garner such a lackluster response. Women from this family know how to burn. You put your foot in it. I've died and gone to heaven. I'm foundered. All appropriate responses that my city man knows nothing about. Even if he closed his eyes and rolled his head back in satisfaction, or a gravelly moan escaped from his lips, that would satiate me. Something that confirms, yes, there is a God, and God touched the woman who made this food. When I called Deborah, we talk about the photographs that my cousin William posts on his Facebook page of the meals he's learning to prepare in culinary school. We make ourselves hungry just talking about them. We talk about each other's children, work, and the extended family. Our conversation is populated with laughter and nostalgia and love. She tells me what she's cooking for supper. I tell Deborah about the hot milk cake. I don't think Granny made that, she says. I think it was Aunt Edith Patton who gave me the recipe, I say. You remember her? We talk about Great Aunt Edith's long white hair, her walk, her face. I tell Deborah about the venison I ate at Aunt Edith's table once. I never heard of hot milk cake, Deborah says. I marvel in its simplicity. It's delicious, I say. I think of Grandma Aggie held in captivity as a slave when I make the cake. It's something she could have made by combining her own rations with a few items taken from the plantation kitchen. 2 weeks ago, when we invited friends over for couples night, my husband cooked his famous fried cabbage. Cabbage, onions, a generous amount of butter and smoked sausage. I don't recall my grandfather ever cooking a meal, but Ron has his specialty and often cooks breakfast in our house. He washes all the dishes. I talk to our friends while he cuts the cabbage and assembles the other ingredients in a skillet. In our 12 years together, I have grown toward an understanding of shared responsibility and welcome him into what was previously my domain. Suddenly, the smell of cabbage cooking blossoms inside me a need for cornbread. I recognize the member easily as soon as it swells up. I spring up from the couch, and my husband and I move around each other in the kitchen like we're dancing, slow, methodical, a meditation. We have a rhythm between us. I mix the eggs and milk and the cornmeal and pour it into a hot skillet. I bake the cornbread. We eat in silence, our forks tinking gently against the plates. One hot night in Florida, while on a writing fellowship, I woke up crying, with Ma Aggie's voice coming through me loud and clear, though she has been gone for more than 150 years. I could hear her voice urgent and persistent. I headed to my writing desk and wrote of her life in 1808 as a Kentucky slave. We slept on the corner of the kitchen. The kitchen smelled of fried meat, copper, and salt. And in the corner where we slept, the air was so humid I felt nauseous. In the wee hours of the morning before the plantation stirred, I lay half asleep, swiping at the net, swarming at the corners of my eyes, and sweating through my dress. It was in those minutes between sleep and wake that I heard my mother singing my name, though she wasn't calling to me in your language. The sound of her voice floated into the window like a feather, then took wing like a bird and flew in a circle around my head before it disappeared up toward the rafters while I lay there in the dark. We take buckets and draw water from the well. We empty the slop jars. We gather eggs from the hen house and a bit of jowl from the smokehouse. We render fat for the biscuits and for the soap. We gather stored ashes and make lye soap. We sold Mrs. a dress, but she wants one more fine, so we give a knapsack to David to take down to the Bowman place for Sally to fix. We draw more water from the well and build a fire in the backyard for washing. We boil the clothes in lye soap, hang the clothes on the line. We cook the hog and the corn. We fold the clothes. We pick vegetables from the garden. We pick worms off the tobacco before Marse Bowman sends his field hands to help. We milk the cows. We churn the butter. We feed the chickens. We slop the hogs. Up in the night, we pick a mess of beans from our own little garden, fry some hoe cakes from our own rations, and eat a little bit for ourselves. We share the food. We share our food. I know that women in my family have been kitchen ghosts for centuries, peeping over the shoulders of our daughters and granddaughters and sons and grandsons, saying, just a little bit more, turn down your fire, not too much salt, please have some, we have plenty. And I imagine myself many years from now standing in my great-grandchildren's kitchen, nodding my head as they work, whispering in their ears, that's right, keep it up. We will always have plenty. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
I would like to see if there are any questions. A lot of great comments while you were reading. People are getting hungry.
Yeah, I don't know if there are questions or not, but I did want to say that the slideshow were members of my family. That rendition that came up of the writing that you could see was actually a document that I found. My third great grandmother, Aggie. That's a document that I found that said her name on it, Aggie of Color. And some of the other images were from the farm. The male images were my grandfather, and so just really my ancestors and my immediate family. And I wanted to put a.
That was beautiful. Where can people? What book is this in, and where can people get the book?
This will be a part of a book of poems and essays called Perfect Black that will be published in August. And that was an excerpt from it. I didn't read the entire thing. I skipped around in it a little bit, but it'll be included in that.
Here's, for example, a comment from Mark Harshman, who is our poet laureate here in the state of West Virginia. Very complimentary.
Oh, thank you, Mark. I had a chance to meet Mark several times over the years, so it's good to know that he was here.
Yeah, and here's a comment from about the memories you evoked with your reading.
Thank you, Benita.
Let's see. Could you describe the milk cake again?
So the milk cake was the most simple. It's like a really plain yellow cake, and I didn't read the recipe, which I can send you the recipe. Or actually, you can Google. There's some old-fashioned ones there, but you would heat the milk up and put the butter in the milk. So it's basically, don't remember exactly, but it's got lots of sugar in it. It's very simple. Lots of sugar, lots of butter, and flour. And my aunt that showed me how to make it made it in a skillet.
I'm going to bring Scott back because he has a question for you.
Okay.
Scott, go ahead and ask your question. Put your sound on. See, I told you you'd forget.
Okay, yeah, you're right. So, being a 23-year Air Force veteran, which allowed me the good fortune and opportunity to travel the world extensively, that also coincided with meeting Black people from all over the United States, mostly major cities. And at 55 years old, it still amazes me when I tell people that I'm from West Virginia. People from large cities, Black people from metropolitan areas are like, they got Black people in West Virginia?
Yeah.
And I just don't understand that level of ignorance. It just, I don't get offended because I've been hearing it all my life, but I'm like, yeah, they got Black people in Idaho, Montana,
Right.
the Dakotas. I'm like, where have you gone wrong with your education?
Yeah, I don't understand it. I mean, I think a lot of it is this sort of mindset. A lot of it's the stereotype, I think, that people really think. I get the same thing all the time when I'm traveling. I'm in New York, California, wherever. I can always tell them, like, when we could meet in person, I would see people coming up the aisle and I would think, okay, here comes this question. And they would say, are you really, start with Kentucky. Are you really from Kentucky? And then it would be like, are you really from rural Kentucky? Are you from Appalachia? Really? There's Black people. Was it just you? And then you have to sort of try to re-educate. So I think that, that's one thing that I see my work. That was a nonfiction piece, but I see my fiction as one of the goals is being to try to re-educate people about how diverse our region is.
Okay.
Yep, absolutely. So I can uniquely identify to your grandmother, because my grandmother was married and had her first child at 14, and my father subsequently was the youngest of 11.
Mm-hmm.
And my grandparents migrated from the South on my dad's side. Well, actually on both sides, but my dad's parents specifically. My grandfather was from just outside Macon, Georgia, and my grandmother, who I mentioned, had her first child at 14, was from Birmingham, Alabama. He brought half of his brothers and sisters, 12, up north to work in the coal mines in lower or southern West Virginia and Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
And then he worked his way up to Bel Air, Ohio, where he worked in the steel mills the rest of his life. So a lot of rich history, as Mr. Trotter pointed out last year, with Blacks that worked in the coal mines in the southern part of the state.
Right. Yeah, you know, I think the region, of course, has its own issues in politics and race and all of those things. But and one thing that I tell people all the time, that it's ours as it is people from other cultures, as much ours as Black people as it is everybody else's. So people often say, why do you still, like, you don't live there anymore? Like, why do you still, you know, it's almost like, why are you still claiming Appalachia? And I'm like, because it's home. Like, it's as much my home as it was anybody else's. And I loved living there and still have a deep reverence for it.
Exactly. I let people know firsthand, I had the best childhood ever, with no regret of where I'm from, what I represent. I just remember when I was born in 65, the first 4 years of my life, Wheeling was segregated to the point where most Blacks lived in East Wheeling, Little Sprinkle, and Center Wheeling. And then urban renewal came in with that promise to redevelop East Wheeling. They never did. And then my parents were recognized as one of the first Black families to move into a brand new housing development called North Park.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was I was for like around 1970. So from 1970 through probably 1980, that 10-year span, it became a working class, some upper middle class neighborhood. Very, you know, I mean, white, Black friends alike, and just a great neighborhood. And that stands out the most to me with regards to my rearing and growing up in that neighborhood before we moved, you know, out in the country in Ogilvie Park. So just wanted to share that.
Thank you. Yeah, we're about the same age, so I think our experiences are similar.
Here's another question about your
Let's see.
language.
Are there any words that you still use in daily life that you that you remember are sorry to see disappearing? Yeah, I try to keep a list of them and use them. And some of them are pronunciations, like wash rag instead of wash rag, and things like that. And some of them are sayings. My husband is from Louisville, so we have this thing going all the time when I say something and he'll go, "What? What are you saying?" And I think one day I said, "It's raining to beat the band." And he said, "What is it doing?" So we kind of go back and forth and kid each other about that. But I'm trying to think of others. I don't have the list in front of me, but I do have a list of words that my grandparents used that I don't use anymore, except for on occasion when I think about it. I'm like, oh, I need to use that word more often.
My grandmother had lunch dinner as well, and she was a daughter of Italian immigrants. So,
what about the distinction between soda pop and I think we called it soda or pop growing up in that region in Wheeling. But as you get exposed to other people, it goes a variation of cola to trying to think of. I just have heard variations.
Yeah. Yeah, we
years.
always said pop. And then I saw a video the other day on people from New Orleans that what they mean by cold drink. Like it's this whole nuanced
Okay.
thing,
Cold
which
drink.
yeah, but it's only certain drinks that you can call a cold drink.
Okay.
And then other things are, I think
Interesting.
the other things are soda. But it was, I think I love to do research on, our own region and other regions and the ways that people speak and live. And I am writing about food a lot lately. So I love the food fights over things like, do you put salt or sugar in grits?
Mhm.
Or do you make certain dishes a particular way? But there are lots of things that make our region distinct.
Food related question here.
I think my children are like, what the pandemic did for us. We weren't able to get together for Thanksgiving or Christmas, and so me and my daughters got on Zoom or on Facebook Live and cooked, and they suddenly and my son, and they suddenly realized how much goes into it, more than just sort of showing up and washing dishes or helping a little bit. And they were astounded about how complicated some of the recipes were, or how easy some of the recipes were, or that they couldn't do it, which they said my corn pudding didn't turn out right. And but they are interested in those recipes and carrying them forward.
So a lot of great comments. Like I said, I encourage you to go read them later on Facebook and YouTube.
Squeaky slide.
Here's another. Mush,
Okay.
popular too. How do you were a vegan for a while?
Vegetarian. We spend about half the year being vegetarians. Like we go through this every year. Like, okay, we're going to be vegetarians, but we never last the whole year. Like I was a vegetarian for about 10 years during my, I don't know, I'll call it my hippie period or whatever it was that I went through. But I was a vegetarian for about 10 years, and I worked on trying to translate dishes that I grew up with, which I did a pretty good job of. And then we go back to meat eating. We always seem to sort of slide into it somehow.
Yeah. When I was a kid, those images that you put in your essay about kids head in the pod, and it reminded me of the cow's tongue that I saw in the oven. And I'm a vegetarian now. I grew up on similar food from my grandmother.
Yeah, I remember. I also had an affinity for all the animals, and even though they always told me not to, I always snuck around and named them all. And so they would just be, I'd have traumatized myself over and over again when they got sold, or it was time to slaughter them or something. But I think there was different reasons to be vegetarians, but I think I was always sort of horrified that there was always a head in the kids, something. I'd come home from school and it'd be something else, there ready to be put on the stove, which of course was what they grew up on, and the way they sustained their families. But even then, I was horrified by it all.
I feel your pain. Any additional questions before we call it a day? I'll give you a moment to think about it. While we do that, I want to remind people that Next week, we have Billy O'Callahan live from Ireland, and the week after that, Cameron Barnett is part of the Wheeling Poetry Series. So that's March 9th. Scott, do you have another question before we go?
Scott asked about are there accents distinctions in Kentucky? And certainly, yeah. I think I'm often a chameleon, which I felt like I had to be. Sometimes you just don't want to discuss your accent. So I became pretty nimble at changing it. And of course, when I teach and I have we all do this. We have different code switching. We have different accents for different things because we don't want to talk about it. This is my natural accent, which I don't think is as twangy as it used to be. But the region I come from is noted for the long eyes. And I remember even when I went to college, I got made fun of a lot because they just thought it was strange that a black girl, a black woman would be saying white and not in rice. But that's the accent from my region. And of course I had it. Everyone who's black spoke the same way. But yeah, there's lots of
night and day between the Northern Panhandle and Southern West Virginia. I mean, have you ever heard Randy Moss speak? You know who Randy Moss is? He's yeah. I just like cringe when I hear him talk, but because he's now a sports analyst, I'm sure somebody has worked with him to
He's still got a strong accent.
Tamp down some of that, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it changes. I can hear our Kentucky regions, particularly, since everybody comes to Lexington to shop, or they did pre-pandemic, or they come here for doctor's appointments. So I've been in the doctor's office before, and my kids were just like, "Oh my God, there she goes again." They're so embarrassed when I go. I'll turn and say, "Where are you from?" Because I'll hear my county's accent.
Right.
And of course I always recognize it, and they always say, "Oh, I'm from Casey County," and I thought, I knew it. And by this time, my kids have slid down into the floor and are like, "Why are you talking to all these people?" But yeah, very distinct differences.
Here's one more question, which is a key one before we go.
Oh, I don't have any books for direct purchase, but you should be able to get them from any bookstore. I've been using bookshop.org. If you go to bookshop.org, it lets you know what store is close to you. So you can actually order online, and they'll ship the book out from a bookstore that's close to you. And that way you're supporting independent bookstores.
And before we go, I wanted to thank the West Virginia Humanities Council, who made our program possible today with financial support. And you see scrolling at the bottom of the screen there, the URL to use to go take our evaluation, which is part of the process for humanities. And if you can't get that typed in, just go to our website and type in West Virginia Humanities, and it will come up in the search field. I want to thank Scott Thomas for being with us today. And thank you, Crystal, for a beautiful reading. It really was delightful. And like I said, I could listen to you all day. Thank you to everyone who attended, and we will see you next week. Bye.